This presentation is about sustainable communities and quality of life for individuals with autism. Just a quick outline here. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. Where I come from is important to this study. Current independent living options for individuals with autism, what we define as sustainable communities, our research study, results, and implications for future research. So as alluded to, I am in the United States. I am in Minnesota, just north of Chicago and Milwaukee and Minneapolis and St. Paul. We conducted this study in the United States. Throughout the country, in all 50 states, we examined sustainable communities. And we'll briefly describe what sustainable communities are here in just a moment. But first, we took a look at the literature and how previous research defined living options for individuals with autism and intellectual disability. We went as far back as 1990 in the literature and gathered individual housing terms throughout various research projects. As you can see here in this graph, on the left-hand side, we found about 6 terms identified in the prior literature, and then we attempted to give those terms that were defined in the literature a United States equivalent, so what the housing types were here in the United States. Most of the housing terms were defined in other countries, so we did our best to link research in other countries to research here in the United States. After we discovered about 60 articles that identified housing terms for individuals only with autism and intellectual disability, we categorized these terms into groups, where we came up with an umbrella term we call collaborative housing, then 3 terms underneath that: dispersed housing, sustainable housing, clustered housing, and then individual terms fell under each one of these 3 categories here. So we grouped these terms based on the definitions that we found on the previous slide. One group did stand out to us, and that group was the sustainable housing, where there was very limited research on this category here that we found. We noticed that there were similar traits to other categories, particularly communal living, but there was a slight difference in how the literature defines sustainable housing, particularly social enterprises that we found across the United States. So that led us to try to operationally define what sustainable communities are, and it became pretty apparent that these communities had some sort of profit that were associated with them, whether it was farming and ranching, or other means. So it was, if you can imagine, communal living and individuals with disabilities and without disabilities taking care of the land, taking care of each other, taking care of the housing that they live in, and then taking it one step further where they were selling their crops, their produce, their livestock, whatever they had in their communities to local communities. So having this integrated experience of inclusion where the people with disabilities were going into communities with people without disabilities and selling whatever they were growing or raising on their farms, on their ranches. And there were quite a few of these communities around the United States. In fact, we found about over 60 communities that had these characteristics tied to them. So here we break the communities down by state across the 50 states. Nearly all states actually had at least one, if not 2 or more communities. So these communities were wider spread than originally thought, but not well represented in research or in practice. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out more about these communities, what was going on, what types of services were provided at the communities, who was providing the services, who were taking care of the people with autism and intellectual disability at these communities, and what kind of experiences the people with disabilities had at these communities across the United States. So we created 2 surveys. One was a quality of life measure, and the other one was a demographics measure. We sent both surveys to the communities and the directors at those communities, and we asked for an individual that was closely associated with the individual with autism or intellectual disability to fill out the survey. So if the individual had a profound disability, the caretaker or the service provider was able to complete the surveys for them. If the disability was less profound, then the individual themselves actually filled out the two surveys. This was not a funded study, so it was not a widespread study. Our sample was small. This was really an exploratory research project at its nature. So most communities did not want to participate in this. Most found it evaluative. Most were protective of their individuals with disabilities and their service providers. However, we did find two very large communities that were more than willing to open up their doors and to conduct this mixed method study where we were able to get into these communities and interview the directors and provide the surveys and directions to complete the surveys. So two of these communities had over 100 individuals with disabilities at their place. And the service directors totaled 12 in number. So we had quite a few service providers complete these studies within these two different communities. So on the right hand, if the text is small, I apologize, but on the right hand side, we have services provided. On the left hand side, we have the demographics, and the services that we asked about were lengthy in nature. So physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language, social service, community access, and there were others that were less reported on. For example, access to a hobby, recreation and leisure, and services that you would envision participating in your lives, in your homes. And really, again, this was to get an idea of what it was like to live at one of these sustainable communities. So after receiving the services completed and the demographic survey completed and the quality of life scores came in, and we charted those quality of life raw scores across the two communities. And as we can see here, an average score is about 60. Total up to 120, 0 is the lowest score possible. So just by briefly glancing at this chart here, we can see that most quality of life scores were above average, with one score below average and one score fairly high at 108. So the quality of life in general, if we can say, is above average at both communities, and with probably two outliers in there. When we correlated the services to quality of life scores, we found that family involvement, so the number of times an individual saw a family member, the number of times a family member was participating in that individual's life, was strongly correlated with the quality of life. And then we also found that education, so employment services, post-secondary education opportunities, and so adult education, those types of educational opportunities, when they were provided at the community, also resulted in a higher score of quality of life. So this chart really shows the quality of life scores on the left, and then the sum scores, service scores on the right. So we took all of the services provided at the communities and we totaled those. So that number there ranged from 0 to 30. And then again, the quality of life score is 0 to 120. And we can see here, we can loosely tie more services equals a higher quality of life. So there was a moderate correlation there to the number of services and the quality of life, which is somewhat apparent here on this chart. In general, what we found is that the services provided at the communities were many in number. So people with autism and intellectual disability had the opportunity to receive many services. The directors were adamant at providing services across lifespan, so age was not dependent on the types of services that individuals received. And then access to the community was also a big indicator in the qualitative part of the study, where directors were strongly adamant about getting individuals with autism and intellectual disability into the community. So really, the main takeaway from this study is sustainable communities are not well researched. Our study was extremely small, only 2 communities of the more than 60 that we found in the United States. We're currently seeking ways to expand the study to focus on 20 to 30 communities in the United States to get a better picture of what these communities are like. If they truly are something beyond communal living, that collaborative housing model is extremely important to understand. If quality of life scores are higher at these communities, if services are being provided on a large scale, it could be something important to people with autism and intellectual disability to consider when leaving high school, when moving into adulthood. It is an independent living option, a place where individuals can earn money, can spend money, can be a part of the community. So it is important to examine on a large scale. And then a comparative study would also be of interest to us and to others possibly out there to look at the similarities and differences of housing models, of sustainable communities and community-based options. For example, group homes are a large model here in the United States, and most people with autism and intellectual disability reside in group homes. So it would be interesting to study what quality of life is there as compared to sustainable communities. And then we would ultimately like to get a model for sustainable communities. There really isn't any regulation or law presiding over these, and the goal would be to prevent sustainable communities from becoming another form of institution, to strive towards independence and community integration as models have done over the previous decades. So continue to see those quality of life levels rise, and for more people with autism and intellectual disability. So those are just a couple of places where we're going with sustainable communities. We think they are innovative and groundbreaking, and we think the research community should start to take a look at these as a legitimate option for individuals with autism and intellectual disability. So that's all I have, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer any.